U.S. President Donald Trump has revised his deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz from Monday to Tuesday. In a post on Truth Social, Trump said it will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. He warned that there will be nothing like it, going on to end his expletive-laden post with praise be to Allah. Now, later, the U.S. president, in a follow-up post, gave a more precise deadline, Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, Trump separately suggested that there is a good chance of an agreement with Iran, telling Fox News that negotiations weren't taking place. He said, and I'm quoting here, "If they don't make a deal and fast, I'm considering blowing everything up and taking over the oil." Now, it is important to point out here that Trump has issued such deadlines before, but has extended them. On the weekend of 20th and 21st of March, Trump threatened to obliterate Iran's power plants within 48 hours unless the country released its stranglehold on Hormuz. And then, on 23rd of March, he extended the deadline for another 5 days amid what he called very good and productive conversations with Iran, which the regime quickly denied.
We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement. I would say almost all points of agreement. Perhaps that hasn't been conveyed. The communication, as you know, has been blown to pieces. They're unable to talk to each other. But we've had very strong talks. Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner had them. They went, I would say, perfectly.
Now, as that date approached, Trump again delayed the deadline by a further 10 days until 6th April. And this is the date that the new 48-hour deadline has been extended from. Iranian Culture Minister Saeed Reza Salini Amiri told AP News in an interview that the U.S. president has become a phenomenon that neither Iranians nor Americans are able to fully analyze. Now, just last week, as Trump addressed Americans, the White House highlighted 4 objectives of the war: destroying Iran's offensive missile capabilities, dismantling its production system, neutralizing its navy and broader security infrastructure, and ensuring that Iran never acquires nuclear weapons. Between March and April, Washington has shifted from a 15-point plan to 4 objectives, representing a narrowing of U.S. goals in the war. Now, as for Iran, the country has demanded reparations, a halt to military actions, and recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's Revolutionary Guards has cleared that the waterway is never going back to its former state, specifically for U.S. and Israel. And for more on this, we're now being joined by James Jackson, live from Berlin. He is a journalist and political analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast, James. Let me begin by Trump, who has now issued expletive-laden threat to Iran over Hormuz Strait blockade. Iran has mocked his ultimatum, dismissing it as helpless, nervous, and stupid, as they called it. Are we looking at a greater escalation if at all Iran does not go for this deal? And what does this escalation look like for you?
I mean, it's entirely possible that there will be a greater escalation. It's also possible this will be an empty threat. It's really hard to calculate what the US has in store. He referred to, Bridge Day and Power Plant Day again. Now, of course, we have to remember that most people, he's talking about bombing a bridge, which is civilian infrastructure. Now, most international legal experts would see that actually as a war crime to target civilian infrastructure. Of course, the US has argued that it's dual use, which is a very convenient weasel word, meaning that, the military can use a bridge. Of course they can use a bridge. But that doesn't mean that it's a legitimate target under international law. But anyway, the US seemed, and by saying it's going to target power plants, that's going to leave ordinary Iranians without power. And of course, there are some nuclear enrichment facilities, which there have been some reports. It's unclear how credible they are that the US, or particularly Israel, is interested in attacking, which could pollute the entire region. We could see something approaching a Chernobyl, probably not as strong. So we have to really question ourselves, why is Trump doing this? And what are they actually aiming? They've said they've listed the 4 goals that you mentioned, but actually it doesn't seem like they're close to achieving any of them. And that's because for Iran, for the Islamic Republic, this fight is existential, whereas For Israel and the US, it really seems to be they chose it without much strategy in mind, probably for political, in my view, for domestic political reasons, as in that Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a re-election campaign, and Donald Trump was trying to, some people think, was trying to distract from the Epstein files quite successfully in this case. But what they've done in this is they've weakened American standing in the world. They've weakened international law, and they've made the previously defeated, seemingly indestructible America look surprisingly weak. I mean, I've previously said on this show that I think this is America's Suez crisis, referring to when the British Empire kind of overreached and Nasser in Egypt took the Suez Canal. But I actually think this is worse because of its damage to the global economy, which has led to European and other countries kind of moving away from the US, and even a step towards de-dollarization, i.e. that the Iranians have said that people can pass through the straits if they're using the Chinese yuan or using crypto. So, it doesn't help. It doesn't pay to be a US ally at this point. And it's one of the first times in history that you can say that. So I think this is really a historic moment.
And that's interesting because now we have to figure out why would Trump actually do this. As you mentioned, political gains because midterm elections. But at the same time, when we look at, Trump, you talked about the Iranians. Trump kept trying to mobilize the Iranian public to go against the regime. And after this threat to the infrastructure, do you think would the Iranians be taking this expletive warning?
Yes, I mean, of course, there were some very large protests against the regime earlier this year, which was met with massacres. The size of those massacres has been disputed, but basically it looks like the strategy of the US to try and get Iranians to protest more has completely failed, shockingly so, terribly failed, because who wants to go outside on the streets when the streets are being bombed, right? And there have been reports in US political media that the Americans knew that this would fail, and they had intelligence reports, and that the Israelis were the ones who actually pushed them into doing it. Not because the Israelis thought it would be popular, because, as there were massacres by the regime, the intelligence report stated that the regime would respond with more massacres. And, the US intelligence didn't think it was very credible, but Trump seems to be listening to the Israelis more than the actual US. And the Israelis didn't really care, seemingly, about possible casualties because they see Iran as their great geopolitical rival. It's long been a fantasy of Netanyahu to have this war. He's been warning about how, famously warning about Iran being 2 weeks away from the nuclear bomb for about 20 years at this point, So this is really just a case, I believe, of the tail wagging the dog, as we say, of the, junior partner in the US-Israeli alliance pushing the US, because partly, and, this is my view, but I think it is held up by the evidence, Trump is desperate and quite weak and possibly even senile. And we've seen some erratic behavior, not just the typical stuff, but going beyond, his expletive-laden remarks, praise be to Allah, stuff like this. It's really bizarre, actually. I think we have to remember that this is not normal from a US president. And we're starting to see, what happens when someone who's very erratic is in charge of the greatest superpower in world history, and it seems quite dangerous for the world.
And while he announces these deadlines, whatever language he may use, we have seen earlier, and as I mentioned in the report, he's extended the deadlines and has always backed it with there are good talks between Iran and U.S. going on. And then according to a Axios report, the U.S. and Iran and a group of regional mediators are discussing the terms for a potential 45-day ceasefire that can lead to a permanent end to the war. Of course, these are reports. Now, Iran has been adamant about keeping its uranium enrichment, which is something that, of course, the U.S. and Israel don't want. What could be the possible terms for Iran at this point to get a ceasefire, according to you?
I think the US wants a ceasefire to save face, and Iran have really been dominating the communications battle, the propaganda war, if you will, with a kind of decentralized meme force, actually, where they've been making jokes about how the US has proclaimed that there are negotiations ongoing, but actually Iran hasn't been at the table because they don't want negotiations, because this is a once in a generation chance to show their military and political strength and to deter any future invaders and aggressors, and to strengthen their position in the region. So, as well as gaining some kind of soft power. So, really, it's quite remarkable that the Iran has managed to, gain popularity in a sense, not in the region, of course, where it's very unpopular with its Gulf rivals and neighbors. But actually, around the world, a lot of people have been seeing what's happening and said, "Wow, the US is weak and Iran is a lot stronger than we thought." So they don't have any reason to go for negotiations until the US is more humiliated and the Iran looks stronger. I mean, it's effectively a war of attrition, of who can fire the most, who runs out first, Iran's missiles or Western US made missile interceptors. And of course, the missile interceptors are very expensive. So this is a war that's costing the US and its allies billions. Of course, it's expensive for the Iranians as well, but they need this, whereas the US allies and its allies don't. So I don't think we're going to see negotiations anytime soon until Iran really does have the upper hand. I think at now it is still kind of all to play for. But one thing I will point out is that with the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei, I think we've seen the death of the nuclear fatwa, which was his religious command that Iran will not develop nuclear weapons. And, Khamenei, as much as he was, in a sense, a religious extremist, in geopolitical terms, it's emerged that he was actually the moderate who was preventing the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, from becoming more aggressive. So I actually think what we're going to see is a much more empowered Iran in the region and potentially worldwide, because Khamenei was the one who wanted them to stop developing long-range ballistic missiles, and of course the nuclear bomb, as I mentioned. So there's no rush for the Iranians to get around the table while they're winning. Why would you negotiate while you're winning? Of course, if the US escalates with something like a nuclear bomb, which is unlikely, but maybe continuing to target civilian infrastructure as Trump has promised, then I think it's quite possible that the cost of the war would get higher. But as I said, the Iranian regime does not have a problem with its people dying. They have this culture of martyrdom, shahid or shahed, within Shia Islam, particularly strong, which is the particular branch of Islam that the Iranian Islamic Republic has. So I think they can fight for a lot longer than the US, and they're much more dedicated to it.
Right, and because you've mentioned, you've also mentioned how there is a possibility that there could be an attack, an escalation. In that case, if at all these infrastructure are harmed in Iran and could be war crime, how do you think the allies will react to this? Because so far, many allies, be it France rather had actually rejected this one. Bahrain had come out with a resolution, France rejected it. But how do you think how does it change the political dynamics in this whole region? Because of course there's Gulf states who were giving money to US for protection, and somehow will they really have been taking a lot of damage, and Iran again has threatened attacks on desalination plants. These are something that is very critical. How do you think this political climate will change, considering the fact that if at all US actually goes for these infrastructure damage in Iran?
Yes, and I think it's worth pointing out, before I answer your question, that the US has also attacked or not just medical laboratories, but pharmaceutical manufacturers. So this is kind of critical infrastructure that only really affects civilians. So there are, the Iranian people are suffering because of this, not just in the bombing. We don't know how many civilians have died, but it could be in the thousands, but when we come onto the geopolitics of it, when we look at the Iranian, when we look at the Gulf states, they've been on a charm offensive with Trump and nearly unprecedented. Of course, Saudi Arabia has always been a key US ally in the region, but Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have really put a lot of money into lobbying Trump. Qatar famously gave him his own private jet, and they must be looking like at this as a real failure on their investment, because it hasn't really protected them. They've realized they don't have an iron dome like Israel does. They've been given a few missile interceptors, more than a few, but Iran has been very clever at working out how to waste those, how to, use attrition to get them down and cause infrastructure damage. And, long-term, medium-term even, we might be seeing an end to US bases in the region, or at least so much US strength. While, of course, in Europe, this is also criticized, caused a chain reaction. Initially, European leaders, for quite selfish reasons, I think, of wanting to keep Trump in NATO, and the US and NATO were not, if they were somewhat supportive, but as it became clear that the US had no strategy, had no plan, and that this was damaging Europe's, quite fragile energy independence and energy economies, they came out and they said, increasingly have protested. I mean, I'm in Germany where Merz wants to be a close US ally, but he, the Chancellor Friedrich Merz, but even he's come out and said, listen, this isn't good for us. Even the president has said, Frank-Walter Steinmeier has said that this is probably against international law, which is very strong criticism from a close NATO ally. So I think what we're seeing is the beginning of the end of global US hegemony. It's not going to be direct. It's not the collapse of the empire, but if we were to, this is I think the beginning of the long end. If we were to look at Edward Gibbon, this would be where the bread and circuses start to go too far, and the Roman emperors start to go a bit crazy, and the power of the empire starts to deplete and decline.
Right. Of course, now Trump has been announcing these deadlines, and now, of course, going back and extending these deadlines. And now we also have to wait for his speech that is going to come. And he has announced that he's going to be addressing, and what he announces there is maybe another deadline or an escalation. We'll have to wait and see. But thank you so much for joining on the broadcasting. That was James Jackson, journalist and political analyst, joining from Berlin. Thank you. Appreciate it.